On a bright holiday afternoon in the spring of 1948, the second largest city in the state of Oregon was fully, ordinarily, alive. Children were playing outside. Families were cooking supper. By nightfall, that city was gone. Not damaged, not evacuated and later rebuilt. Gone, erased so completely that today you can stand on the exact ground where 40,000 people once lived and see only a racetrack, a golf course, and open marsh. What makes this almost impossible to believe is how the city had begun. It had not grown slowly over generations. It had appeared from nothing in 110 days. And on the very morning it drowned, its people had been handed a promise in writing. The promise told them the walls holding back the river were safe. It told them there was no reason to worry. It told them that if danger ever came, they would be warned and they would have time to leave. Every word of that promise would be broken before the sun went down. And the story of how an entire American city could rise in a matter of months and vanish in a matter of hours begins with a single decision made years earlier about where to put the people nobody else was willing to house. The year was 1942. The United States was at war, and along the rivers around Portland, Oregon, the shipyards of an industrialist named Henry Kaiser were building vessels faster than anyone thought possible. To do it, Kaiser needed workers, and he recruited them from every corner of the country. More than 70,000 people poured into the Portland area. Wartime employment in the region climbed toward 140,000. There was nowhere to put them. Portland at that moment was the only major city on the West Coast without a public housing authority. The private real estate industry did not want government housing competing with it, and the industry's own code of conduct quietly restricted where black families were permitted to rent or buy, closing off most of the city to the thousands of African American workers who had come to build ships. Kaiser could not wait for the city to solve this, so his son, Edgar Kaiser, went around it entirely, straight to the federal government and the United States Maritime Commission. The commission approved the plan on August 18, 1942. The site they selected tells you everything you need to know. It was roughly 650 acres of low, flat floodplain along the Columbia River just north of Portland, land that stood empty because it was land that flooded. The government spent about $26 million to buy it and build on it. Then came the miracle, and that word was used without a trace of irony. In 110 days, construction crews raised an entire city, more than 10,000 apartments and homes, along with schools, stores, and a hospital. It was built fast, and it was built cheap. Wood and fiberboard, thin walls, and one detail that would matter more than any other. The buildings had no foundations. They rested on blocks sitting lightly on ground that had been swamp only months before. They named it Vanport, a word stitched together from Vancouver and Portland, the two cities it sat between. Some people called it Kaiserville. The newspapers called it the Miracle City. By the time it filled, roughly 40,000 people were living inside it. Overnight, Vanport had become the second largest city in Oregon and the largest wartime housing project in the entire United States. But a city can be built in 100 days. It cannot be handed 100 years of solid ground. And Vanport carried a flaw buried in the earth beneath it. Its lowest point sat about 15 feet below the surface of the river beside it. The only thing keeping the Columbia out was a ring of earthen walls, nearly 5 miles of dikes wrapped around the town on all 4 sides. Most had been built to hold water, one had not. Along the western edge ran a railroad embankment, a wall of packed earth that had never been designed as a dike at all, and nearly everyone assumed it was the strongest barrier of them all. It was, in truth, the weakest. For 5 years it held, a temporary city, standing in the path of a river, waiting for a spring that would come. Consider a single classroom in Vanport in 1944. In it sat a black child and a white child, side by side, learning from the same teacher. And that teacher might herself have been black, one of the first African-American teachers ever hired anywhere in the state of Oregon. To understand how extraordinary that was, you have to understand the state it was happening in. Oregon had entered the Union with a clause written into its own constitution, barring black people from settling there at all. And yet here, on a floodplain that was never meant to be permanent, the most racially mixed city in Oregon had sprung up almost by accident. It was a fragile thing, this community, and it was living on borrowed ground and borrowed time. The reason Vanport looked the way it did came down to arithmetic, not idealism. Henry Kaiser needed ships built, and to build them he needed hands, and he did not much care what color those hands were. His shipyards hired black workers by the thousands, at a time when most American industry would not. And because Vanport was built to house those workers, Vanport was open to all of them. The result was staggering for the region. At the height of the war, as many as 10,000 black residents lived in Vanport, more than 3 times the number who had lived in all of Portland just 2 years earlier. For many, it was the first place in the Pacific Northwest that had simply let them in. Inside the city, the walls that divided the rest of America came down in ways that were rare for the 1940s. The schools were integrated. The child care centers were integrated. The playgrounds and recreation halls were shared. Vanport hired the first black teachers and the first black police officers in the history of the state. One of those teachers, a woman named Martha Jordan, would later become the first black teacher hired by the Portland Public Schools. This is the part of the story that is easy to romanticize, and it should not be. Life in Vanport was not equal. Black families were quietly steered into the least desirable buildings. The community was unfairly branded as a place of crime and disorder, even though its actual crime rate was no higher than the rest of the city. And the officials of Portland made little secret of how they felt about the place. The mayor, Earl Riley, called Vanport a great headache and a municipal monstrosity. There was also a restlessness built into the city from the beginning. Vanport was temporary by design, a town of strangers who had come from everywhere and expected to leave. When the war ended and the shipyard jobs dried up, people left in enormous numbers. At one point, families were moving out at a rate of 100 a day. The population fell from roughly 40,000 toward 18,000. But many stayed, and a great many of those who stayed were black families who had nowhere else to go. The same real estate rules that had kept them out of Portland during the war were still in force after it. Vanport, whatever its flaws, was home, and it was becoming something more. On the edge of town, near the dike, the state opened a college for returning veterans, the Vanport Extension Center. It was the only public college in the entire Portland area, and thousands came to take classes there. Nobody knew it yet, but that little school beside the river would outlive the city itself and grow into what is today Portland State University. So by the spring of 1948, Vanport was a paradox standing on soft ground. It was poor, it was overcrowded, and it was looked down upon. But it was also, quietly, one of the most genuinely integrated communities in the United States. A place where a certain kind of American future was being tried out, years ahead of the rest of the country. The region around it had never truly accepted it, and all of it, the classrooms, the college, the 18,000 lives, still sat 15 feet below a river, behind a wall of earth. Nobody was worried. It was going to be a beautiful holiday weekend. On the morning of Memorial Day, the 30th of May, 1948, the people of Vanport woke to find a printed notice slipped under their doors. It came from the Housing Authority of Portland, the agency that ran the city, and its message was calm and reassuring. The dikes were safe, it said. There was no cause for alarm. If any real danger developed, residents would be warned in plenty of time, and they would be able to leave. And it ended with a blunt reassurance. There was no reason to get excited. What the notice did not say was that, at that very moment, the people who ran Vanport were quietly carrying their own filing cabinets and equipment out of the city, and that one of the walls holding back the river had been leaking since early that morning. To understand the danger, you have to go back a few weeks. The winter of 1947 and 48 had buried the mountains of the Pacific Northwest in deep snow. Then, in May, the weather turned warm and wet at the worst possible time. 2 heavy rainstorms swept through the region, one in the 3rd week of the month and another at its end. The rain fell on the melting snowpack, and all of that water drained into the tributaries of one river, the Columbia. The Columbia began to rise, and it kept rising day after day toward levels no one had seen since the Great Flood of 1894. By the 25th of May, the river was running roughly 8 feet above flood stage. Officials knew, beginning that day, crews walked the dikes around Vanport, watching for weakness. But the residents inside the city were told almost nothing. The United States Army Corps of Engineers had assured the Housing Authority that the dikes would hold and that Vanport would stay dry. So the message passed along to the residents was, in essence, everything is fine. Behind the scenes, the story was different. As the river climbed, the Housing Authority quietly moved its own records and office equipment to higher ground. At the racetrack next door, Portland Meadows, roughly 600 horses were evacuated to safety. The animals and the paperwork were being protected. The people were being told not to worry, and there was a specific, fatal blind spot in the wall around them. Vanport was ringed by nearly 5 miles of dikes, but one long stretch on the western edge was not a dike at all. It was a railroad embankment, a bank of packed earth built to carry trains, never engineered to hold back a flooding river. Because it was solid and it was tall, almost everyone assumed it was the sturdiest barrier of the 4. It was the opposite, and on the morning of the 30th, water was already working at it, a problem first noticed roughly 7 hours before the wall finally failed. The people of Vanport were unusually helpless in the face of all this, and not by any fault of their own. Many of them owned no car. They depended entirely on buses and streetcars to get anywhere. Their safety rested on a system of warning sirens and on the word of the authorities. This was a city of newcomers, thousands of strangers who had arrived from across the country and had no deep roots, no long memory of the river, no reason to distrust the men in charge. A radio alert had gone out the night before, and some cautious families had carried their belongings up into attics and onto upper floors just in case. But few imagined how high the water could truly climb, or how fast. So on that bright holiday afternoon, Vanport did what it had been told to do. It relaxed. Families spread out picnics. Some drove off to enjoy the beautiful weather. Children played in the streets between the apartment blocks. Above them, unseen, the Columbia River pressed against the dikes at a level 15 feet higher than the ground they stood on. The entire city was resting its life on a single promise, printed on a slip of paper, and that promise had only a few hours left to live. It was shortly after 4 o'clock in the afternoon when the wall finally gave way. At first it was almost nothing, a hole in the railroad embankment no wider than a man, water pushing through in a thin, dark stream. Within minutes the hole was 100 feet across, then several hundred. The packed earth simply dissolved, and the Columbia River poured into Vanport, not as a rising tide creeping up the streets, but as waves, moving walls of water, breaking like surf against the sides of the buildings. And the first people to run through the city, shouting that the dike had broken, were not the police and not the men from the housing authority. They were students and teachers from Vanport College, who had come in on their holiday Sunday only to rescue their research and their papers. The geography that had doomed Vanport now, briefly, saved lives. Between the broken embankment and the crowded heart of the city lay the Columbia Slough, a low channel of water and marsh. As the flood surged in, the slough swallowed part of it, slowing the wave and buying the people of Vanport a handful of precious minutes. It was not much, but in those minutes thousands of them ran. They ran because word was spreading in the only way it could. Person to person, door to door, shouted from cars and porches. The warning sirens, the system so many residents had been told to trust, did not perform the way they were supposed to. Electricity failed. Telephone lines went dead. The one thing that worked was human voices, passing the alarm from block to block. Getting out was its own nightmare. Vanport had only a few roads leading to higher ground, and now they were jammed with people and cars, all trying to leave at the same instant. Worse, some of those escape routes ran along the very embankments that were failing. People abandoned their vehicles and went on foot. Others were pulled up onto rooftops or into the upper floors of the two-story buildings to wait. And the water kept coming. Remember that the lowest ground in Vanport sat about 15 feet below the level of the river. That was how deep the flood could go, and it went there fast. The cheap apartments, the ones built without foundations, did exactly what their construction had always threatened. They lifted off their blocks. Whole buildings floated, turned, and broke apart. Within roughly an hour, much of the city was already underwater. By nightfall, it was gone. Here is the part of the story that is almost impossible to believe, and it is the one mercy in all of it. In a city of some 18,000 people, drowned in an afternoon, the official death toll was 15. That number is low for reasons worth naming. It was Memorial Day, a holiday, and thousands of residents were simply away, out of town, at picnics, off enjoying the sunshine. The slough had bought its minutes, and the warning, however it traveled just fast enough for most. But 15 does not capture the fear of those first days. In the chaos, the Red Cross could not account for everyone. At one point, its list of the missing swelled to 52 people, and all but 7 of them were children. Families were scattered across churches and shelters and the homes of strangers, not knowing who had made it out. The water receded so slowly that the ground was not uncovered for weeks, and it would be months before the final count of the lost was settled. What was certain was the scale of what had been erased. In a single evening, roughly 18,500 people had lost their homes. The property destroyed was valued at around $21.5 million. The largest wartime housing project in the United States, the second largest city in Oregon, was simply not there anymore. When the sun set on Memorial Day, 1948, the place where 40,000 people had once lived was a silent, spreading lake, rooftops and treetops breaking its surface, and the Columbia River, calm now, resting where a city used to be. It took weeks. The Columbia crested at about 30 feet on the 1st of June and then, grudgingly, began to fall. But the flood drained so slowly that the ground where Vanport had stood stayed hidden under water for weeks. And when the water was finally gone, there was no ruined city waiting underneath it. There were no burned-out blocks, no rows of standing shells, none of the wreckage a town usually leaves behind. Vanport had not been damaged. It had been erased. But the 18,000 people it had held did not vanish with it. They had to go somewhere, and where they went would reshape the city of Portland for the next half-century. The response was immediate, and it was national. On the 11th of June, President Harry Truman himself flew to Portland to look at the damage. The Red Cross opened relief centers. The Army housed flood victims at its barracks across the river. Churches took people in. Families crowded into the homes of relatives, friends, and strangers, carrying whatever they had managed to save. And almost at once the decision was made that Vanport would never be rebuilt. The miracle city had lasted just 5 years. Now it was simply gone from the map. For most of the white families who had lived there, the flood was a catastrophe they could recover from. The rest of Portland's housing, closed to others, was open to them. For the black families, roughly a third of everyone displaced, it was something harder. They had come to Vanport because it was one of the only places in the region that would have them, and now that place no longer existed. The same rules that had kept them out before the flood were still waiting for them after it. The city's leaders did not hide their reluctance. Portland's mayor stated plainly that the city could take in only a minimal number of black residents without disturbing its ordinary life. But the people had nowhere else to go, and so slowly they moved into the one part of Portland that was open to them, a district on the north and east side called Albina. Over the following decades, Albina became the heart of Black Portland, and it also became a case study in what happens to a neighborhood that a city chooses to neglect. Investment dried up. Home loans were denied. The value of property was allowed to fall far below the rest of the city. Historians would later draw a direct line between the flood of 1948 and generations of hardship that followed. Some would compare it to a much later American disaster, Hurricane Katrina, where officials again played down the danger and where a largely black community again paid the highest price. But the story does not end only in loss, and honesty requires telling the other half. Some black leaders came to argue that the flood, for all its cruelty, forced Portland to finally confront the walls it had built. Thousands of black Oregonians who had been kept at the edge of the city were now inside it, and they could not be made to disappear. The disaster, in a bitter and roundabout way, helped push a closed city toward becoming an open one. and one piece of Vanport refused to die. The little college by the dike, the school for veterans, survived the flood by relocating. It kept growing until it became Portland State University, today one of the largest universities in Oregon. A city that lasted 5 years produced an institution that has now lasted more than 70. Go looking for Vanport today, and you will not find it. On the ground where the second largest city in Oregon once stood, there is a public park, a golf course, and a motor racetrack where cars run laps on quiet weekends. There are wetlands where birds gather, and there are a few historical markers, small and easy to miss, explaining to anyone who stops that 40,000 people once lived, worked, studied, and raised their children on this exact spot. The Columbia had loaned that low ground to a city for 5 short years. On a spring afternoon in 1948, without warning and without apology, the river took it back.